Hi everyone and welcome to Knit Cat Paddywhack. I'm Kat and I have a knitting podcast on this channel which usually comes out every 2 weeks. But for the next few weeks I'm going to have a couple of bonus videos that will come out in addition to my normal podcast. And I am going to be talking about my hand knitted wedding dress. So I designed and knit my own lace wedding gown for my wedding, which was back in February 2016. It's an off-the-shoulder dress with long sleeves and a small train. It was white and it had an ivory dress which went underneath it. I also wore a sash and a headpiece which were also handmade. The headpiece was made of knitted wire, and a veil which was pre-existing but which I heavily modified. My wedding dress is my knitting masterpiece so far, and it was really special to me and I felt really special wearing it on the day. So I am really excited to share with you a little bit about it. So I've had a little bit of interest about my wedding dress since I mentioned it in a podcast episode a few weeks ago, and I was already actually considering making some videos about it. So I thought that I would do 2 videos about my wedding dress, and throughout those videos I will answer a few questions which viewers have asked me about it. So my videos are going to cover the how and the what of my wedding dress, and I was going to do a 3rd video which was my why, kind of a bit of a story time about how I came to be the type of person who would dare to knit her own wedding dress, kind of a show and tell story time sort of thing. But as I was writing notes for that episode, I wasn't really sure if it would be interesting for you. So if you would really like to see that episode, I'm happy to make a 3rd one, a why, but for now I don't think I'll do that, and we'll just stick to the how and the what. And I did take some photos of the dress while it was being constructed. So I will be using those pictures for these videos, but just bear in mind that I just took them for my own personal record. I didn't have a YouTube channel at the time, so they're not great quality. They're mostly done on my iPad, so they will hopefully give you a little bit of an idea. Just bear in mind that the quality won't be great. So in today's episode I'm going to be talking about the how of my wedding dress. So I'm going to share a little bit of a timeline from when I started to seriously plan it to how I designed it, how it's constructed, what I used to make it, how long it took me, how much it cost me, all of that sort of stuff, and also some practical things that I did, things that I learned along the way. And hopefully if you're planning to knit your own wedding dress, that this video might be interesting, informative, maybe even motivate you to have a go. In my next episode, which will be in a couple of weeks' time, is my what episode of my wedding dress, and so what it looks like, I will get it out, I'll put it on, show it to you, you can see how it drapes, things like that. I will talk a little bit more in that episode about things that went wrong in the design process, in the construction process, and things that I would do differently, things that I loved about it, things that I loved less about it. And I also, back in 2016, I actually did write a few blog posts about my wedding dress. So I will link those in the description below if you're interested in reading about it. Those blog posts will go into more detail than what I will cover in these videos, because these videos would just be too long if I were to go into every detail about it. And don't forget that in between these 2 wedding dress videos, I'm going to continue doing my knitting podcast. So let's get into today's episode, my how I made my wedding dress. So just to give you a little bit of a timeline, so I started dating my now husband in February of 2015, and we were friends for about a year before that, but we started dating February of 2015 and we got married in February of 2016. So as you can probably tell by that relatively short timeline, we did know pretty soon after we started going out that we were going to marry each other. It was about 6 weeks into our relationship that I would say that we were secretly engaged. So we were engaged between ourselves, but we hadn't told anybody yet. There was no ring or anything like that. And we were engaged officially 4.5 months after we started dating. So that was the down on the knee proposal with a ring and everything. But because I did know that we were going to get engaged, I had already kind of started making preparations for my wedding dress. So truth be told, I have been planning to knit my own wedding dress for years, maybe 5 years before I got married, many years before I met my husband. I knew that I was going to be knitting my own wedding dress, so I already had an idea in my head of roughly what it was going to look like, but that is another story. That is the why episode, if you'd be interested in that sort of episode. But we won't go into all of that backstory. But a month or two before we got engaged, I was kind of sneakily online watching a dress that would be the dress that went underneath my knitted part of my wedding dress, and I was about to go overseas. I was going to go to Europe with my mum and my brother to see my sister who lives in Sweden, and also just tour around Europe. So I was watching this dress, I was about to go overseas, and the dress came up on sale, so I bought it, and it arrived, and I very kind of sneakily hid it under my bed, and I felt kind of really weird owning a wedding dress even though I wasn't engaged. And by the way, yes, I did keep my wedding dress secret from my husband until the big day, and also we didn't live together before we got married, so me hiding the dress under my bed he was never gonna find it there. So I had my secret. I felt really dodgy with having a wedding dress that, even though I wasn't engaged, but that was hidden under my bed before we got engaged. And also I had bought a ball of yarn, which I was already playing around with before we got engaged, and I will go into more detail about the yarn that I chose and why I chose it in a few more minutes. So fast forward to actually getting engaged, and then so shortly after that was when I started to seriously sit down and design my dress. And so the time I had between getting engaged and getting married was about 7.5 months, so that was the amount of time I had to both design and knit the dress. And so to answer a question from Lexi of the Lexi Knits podcast, you should go check her out. She's got a great knitting podcast. But she has asked how long it took me to make it. And I would say from getting engaged, which was when the serious designing started, to finishing the dress was about 6 months. So let's talk now about my design process. And to answer a question from Tina about what type and thickness of yarn I used, I have some of the yarn still here to show you. And so like I said earlier, I had already started playing around with yarn and swatches and stuff before we got engaged and before I started seriously designing it. But I did already have a bit of an idea about what kind of dress I wanted long before that. So I did have an idea about what kind of yarn would be good. So I wanted one that had a slight sheen to it, and I wanted one that wasn't woolly. It had to be fairly fine, because I wanted quite an open work lace design. And because I'm a vegetarian and also really cheap, I didn't want any silk. And I know that you can get vegetarian silk, but that's expensive. So that actually did leave me with quite a few different options. There's mercerized cotton, there's bamboo, which is lovely to work with, and certain kinds of acrylic as well. In the end, I chose this yarn, which is called Satin by Milford, and I think the colour is just white. It is a very pure white sort of colour. It's a 2-ply mercerized cotton, and I think it's more of a crochet cotton for doilies, but that's what I used. In terms of what colour, what shade of white, pure white or ivory or whatever, I kind of went with what was available at Spotlight, and this is what there was. That was what I would consider a wedding dress colour. And I wasn't sure how it would go with the ivory dress underneath, but turns out that it was fine. And to answer a question from Lexi again about how much the dress cost me, The answer is I'm not totally sure, because I did lose track a bit because I had a few different yarn shopping trips, and I did end up buying a lot more yarn than I needed for it. But my guess is between $180 and $200 in material. So $40 for the dress and $140 to $160 for yarn, and then a very small amount for ribbon as well. So yes, I did buy a lot more yarn than needed. So much so that when we got pregnant and I was making a baptism gown for my babies, I still had yarn left over, and I made the gown and the bonnet that my babies wore for their baptisms from leftover yarn from my wedding dress. I've also made a washcloth from it, and I've still got some left over. So I bought more than I needed, but you know, it's better than not enough. And so to find the right needle size, so that took a lot of swatching. I tried the stitch pattern out that I was going to use with various different sizes of needles. I started off with fairly big size, so I think it was about 4.5mm needles, because I did want something that was quite open. But I found that with such large needles on such fine yarn, you lost the definition of the leaves. And so the stitch pattern that I chose was called Willow Leaves, and I got it from looking at a shawl pattern called the Heliotaxis Pie shawl, which I will link in the description below. It's actually a free pattern on Ravelry, but that stitch pattern called Willow Leaves was on that shawl pattern, and that's what I used as the main stitch pattern for my dress. So doing swatching with the larger needles, I found that the leaf shape in the pattern didn't show up as well as I'd like, so I just basically swatched with smaller and smaller needles until I found a type of fabric that I liked, and that ended up with me using 3.75mm needles. And I think that I used that for the entire dress, 3.75mm needles. So I will put some pictures of my dress on the screen now so we can have a look at it. So as you can see, it's got sleeves. It is knit mostly in the same stitch pattern, that Willow Leaves pattern. And to break down the construction of my dress, it's got the two sleeves which were knit separately and flat. The dress, most of the dress is done in one piece, partly flat, partly in the round. The train is a continuation of the dress. There is some trim around the bottom of the dress, which was knit sort of knit sideways and picked up with the live stitches of the bottom of the dress as I went along. And then the shoulder strap, we'll call it, so the bit that went around here, was picked up from the top of the dress and then knit upwards. And I'm not going to go into super fine detail about the design of my dress, just because that would take a really long time. If you have a look at the blog posts in the description below, they go into more detail. If you are nerdy about all of the maths and stuff, there is a bit more detail in there. But I actually have the notes that I took when I was designing my dress here. So as you can see, there are lots and lots of different measurements I took. So that was basically the first step in designing it. Because I already did have a bit of a picture in my head, the first step was to take measurements of my body. So I took lots of different measurements. And so I took measurements around bits, and then I took measurements from the distance between one measurement to another. So you can read in my blog post in more detail about what those measurements were, but just as an example, for the sleeves, the measurements I took were the wrist circumference, the arm circumference at the elbow, and then the distance between those two measurements, and the arm circumference at the underarm, and then the distance between the elbow and the underarm measurements. So let's take the sleeves again as an example of how I calculated the stitch number for a pattern, and I applied basically the same principle to the rest of the dress as well. So it was actually a relatively simple design in terms of shaping, because I knew that people weren't going to be looking at the fine details of the dress. They were just going to be like, wow, wedding dress. So I didn't do darts or anything like that. As you'll see, the shaping was extremely simple. So the sleeves were knitted flat and then seamed. And the stitch pattern I used was the Willow Leaves pattern, which I've mentioned earlier, and it had, thankfully, a very convenient tension. So stitch-wise, one repeat was 10 centimeters. So that was 16 stitches to 10 centimeters, but it was very conveniently one full pattern repeat. And then row wise, the pattern repeat was 5.5 centimeters. So that was really handy. So let's split up my working out in width and length. So stitches and rows. So in terms of the width, so at my wrist it was 14 centimeters, which is 1.5 pattern repeats, and then at my elbow it was 24 centimeters, which was 2.5 pattern repeats, and at my underarm the arm circumference was 3 pattern repeats. And so to begin with, I went bottom up, so I started off with 1.5 pattern repeats because that was the width of my wrist, and then when I increased to get to the elbow, I would increase by half a pattern repeat at a time. And I didn't make any effort in trying to make the patterns, like the breaks in the pattern, the increases, flow nicely to each other. I will put up a picture here of an example of a bit of the dress being constructed, and you can see the breaks where I have increased, and you can see that I made no effort to make them flow nicely or anything like that. I just increased by a certain number of stitches evenly throughout and did that incrementally. And the reason for that is, well, I didn't have all that much time to faff around with darts or making the patterns flow nicely, and I also knew that nobody would really notice. If I had more time to design my dress, I would probably have put in more effort around that, but I didn't, and nobody noticed. And similarly with the length, knitting wise, so my arms were 50 centimeters long. I rounded that to the nearest number of pattern repeats, and then I worked that. I think it was 9 pattern repeats. So just to give you a brief rundown of the rest of the dress, I won't talk forever about this, but so the rest of the dress was worked more or less the same as the sleeves, in terms of like how I calculated things, how I took lots of measurements, and then the shaping was very simple. So for the dress, from the top of the dress down to my hips, it was worked flat. And there was down what would be the middle of my back, there was a garter stitch border with eyelets through it so that it could be laced up. And I did it that way because it had a lot of negative ease and I wanted it to be very fitted. The negative ease was partly because I wanted it to be tight, but also because I was in the process of losing weight around the time that I was designing and knitting my wedding dress. So shortly before we got engaged, I had just finished my master's degree, and the last stretch of the thesis writing portion of my master's degree was fueled by chocolate. So I had a lot of weight to lose. So as we were preparing for the wedding, I was also losing weight. And so I had to account for that when I was designing the dress. And I designed the dress sort of bit by bit. So I would be like, okay, I'm up to the sleeves now. Design the sleeves, knit the sleeves, and then it's like, okay, now I need to design the top of the dress down to my hips, design that bit, knit that bit, and then now I'm down to working on the skirt, etc., etc. So from the hips down on my dress, that's knit in the round. And where the garter stitch border with the eyelets had been, that was just, I did a simple mesh panel down the middle. And then on the front, on the bottom of the dress, I worked a stitch called a grandmother's lace edging, and that was worked sideways, and then as I went, I would pick up the live stitch from the bottom of the dress to attach the lace edging to it. And around the back was where I worked the train. So the train was worked pretty simply. Basically I knit down to the floor level, and then I used short row shaping to make basically a semicircular train. And the train was worked in the same mesh panel that I had been carrying down the middle back of the dress. And I edged the train with the willow leaf edging, which can also be found in the Heliotaxis pie shawl pattern if you're interested. It's beautiful. And then when that was all done, I was up to attaching the sleeves to the dress using what I'm going to call the shoulder strap. And so that was really where the issues came up, and I'll talk about that a bit more in my next video. But So I started off trying to do the grandmother's lace edging, which I had done on the bottom of the dress, and that didn't work. So I had to find something else to use. And the pattern that I ended up using was called the peacock tail stitch. And that is worked from by picking up stitches around the shoulder strap. And then I worked a couple of inches of stocking stitch, and then I worked the peacock edging, the peacock's tail stitch upwards. So yes, I hope that you followed that. I hope that that was interesting. That is the knitting part of the dress done, and then there was the sewing part of the dress. So as I said earlier, I had this underdress that I'd bought online. I bought it from Boohoo, by the way. I'm pretty sure it's discontinued. I think that was the reason why it went on sale. They were done with that particular design. But that was where I bought it from. Maybe they've got something similar if you're interested. But so I bought this dress, beautiful plain dress with a mermaid skirt. That was what I was looking for. A fishtail skirt as well is another thing that it's called. But it had this big peplum around it, which had to go. And I can't sew super well, but I did. So I let a couple of friends in on the secret that I was knitting my wedding dress, so that I could borrow their sewing machine, and with a bit of guidance from one of those friends, I managed to unpick the dress. So I split it in two at the waist and take out the peplum and sew it back together, and it worked really well. It was fairly neat. So that's the sewing part of the dress. Yeah, so that's basically the construction of the dress. That's basically my how. Just to answer another question that was also put out by Lexi, did I work on it every day or did I take breaks? I'd say that I worked on it most days consistently, except if I was really stressed or really busy, then I might take a few days off. But I wasn't really knitting anything else in between. I did, to begin with, have like a decoy project. I had some socks on the go, so that if I was with my now husband, I could be like, if I was hanging out with him, I'd be like knitting the socks and he wouldn't think it was weird that I'd just suddenly stopped knitting. But after a while I realised he didn't really notice, so I stopped working on those and I just exclusively just didn't knit in front of him and just worked on my dress in the meantime. So I worked on my dress when he wasn't around, when I was at my own place, and also I would bring my knitting to work as well. I, as a counsellor, had my own office, so I could knit in privacy. Nobody would be like, "Ooh, what are you doing?" Because I was pretty nervous about knitting my dress. One reason why I didn't tell that many people about it was because I wasn't sure if I could pull it off, and I thought maybe there was a chance that I'd have to rush out and buy a dress at the last minute. But that's not the case. It did work out really well. Yeah, so I think that is my how video done. Hopefully it wasn't too long for you, and I hope that it was interesting as well. In my next video, I'm really excited about that one because I'm going to show you my dress in real life. I'll get it out, I'll clean it and put it on, and you can see how it drapes on a body. We can see how it held up after 4.5 years in a dress bag. And I'll talk a little bit more about things that didn't go to plan, things that I would do differently, things that I loved about it. And I'm really interested in that because I actually haven't looked at my dress in years myself. It's just been in storage, so that will be really, really exciting, and I hope that you will join me for that one next time. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.